Dear students, today's topic is one of the most profound and intellectually inspiring questions in the CSS and PMS IR syllabus. The question before us is IR is a study of world community in transition. Discuss. Before we begin, I would like you to reflect on a question that often goes unasked in our study of IR. When we open newspapers or watch television, we constantly encounter phrases like the changing world order, the rise of new powers, the decline of the West, the emergence of multipolar world. But let me ask you something deeper. If IR is indeed the study of a world community in transition, then what exactly is transitioning? Is it merely the distribution of power? Is it the nature of conflict and cooperation? Is it the very structure of international system itself? Or is it something more fundamental, the way human beings organize their collective existence? And here is perhaps the most important question. If the world community is perpetually in transition, then what does it mean to study IR at all? These questions immediately tell us that a subject is far more complex and dynamic than a simple listing of facts, dates, and treaties. The purpose of today's lecture is not to provide you with a rigid definition that you can memorize and reproduce. Our purpose is to develop a sophisticated understanding of why IR must be understood as a dynamic, evolving field and why the word transition is not merely descriptive but analytical. This is exactly what the word discuss requires. A discussion does not demand a one sided answer, it requires us to examine evidence from different perspectives, consider multiple theoretical frameworks, and arrive at a reasoned judgment that demonstrates analytical depth. This is precisely what examiners at the CSS and PMS level expect. So the question is, what do we mean by IR? Before we can discuss whether IR is a study of a world community in transition, we must first understand what international relation itself means. IR is the systematic study of interactions between sovereign states, international organizations, non-state actors, and transnational forces operating across national boundaries. But notice something important. IR is not merely the study of diplomacy or foreign policy. Let me illustrate this with an example. When we study the Cold War, we are not simply studying American and Soviet diplomacy. We are studying the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, the military balance created by nuclear weapons, the economic competition between two different systems, the cultural and psychological dimensions of the conflict, the impact on developing nations caught between the two superpowers. In other words, IR encompasses everything that connects peoples, states, and societies across borders. This immediately tells us that IR is inherently complex, multidimensional, and, as our question suggests, continually evolving. So, what do we mean by world community? The word uh, world community is itself interesting and somewhat aspirational. Professor Hadley Bull, in his classic work, The Anarchical Society, asked a fundamental question. Is there truly an international community or merely an international system? Let me explain this distinction. An international system exists when states interact with sufficient frequency and impact that the behavior of each affects the others. An international community, however, implies something more: shared values and norms, common institutions, mutual recognition of rights and obligations, a sense of collective identity. Bull argued that while an international system has existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, a genuine international community remains incomplete. This is a crucial insight for today's discussion. When the question speaks of the world community in transition, it is suggesting that we are moving, however imperfectly, from a mere international system towards something resembling a genuine community. But is this true? Let's examine the evidence. What do we mean by transition? This is perhaps the most important word in the question. Transition implies change, movement, transformation. But what kind of change? Historically, IR scholars have identified several types of transition. Power transition, the shift of power from one state to another. Structural transition, changes in the fundamental architecture of the international system. Normative transition, changes in the values and principles governing international behavior. Technological transition, changes driven by innovations in communication, transportation, and warfare. Ecological transition, changes driven by environmental pressures and resource constraints. All of these transitions are occurring simultaneously today. This is what makes our study so intellectually exciting and so challenging. So we now are coming to the evolution of the international system. Students, let's now examine how international relations have evolved through history. The historical perspective is essential for understanding why transition is not a new phenomenon but rather the defining characteristic of our field. Before the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the world did not consist of sovereign nation states. Instead, international relations was characterized by empires, the empire of Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Mongol, Chinese city-states, of Greek city-states, Italian city-states, feudal kingdoms like in medieval Europe, and religious authorities like the papacy and caliphates. So, international relations in this period was not interstate in our modern sense. It was complex web of overlapping authorities, loyalties, and jurisdictions. The transition from this medieval system to the modern state system represents the first great transition in IR. The Peace of Westphalia established the modern state system based on sovereignty. Each state has supreme authority within its territory. Territoriality, clear boundaries between states. Non-intervention, states do not interfere in each other's internal affairs. Legal equality, states are equal in international law. This system, which Professor Kenneth Waltz described as anarchic, has shaped IR for nearly 400 years. But notice something important. Even this foundational system was not static. Following the Napoleonic Wars, European powers established the Concert of Europe. This represented a transition from unregulated competition to managed cooperation among the great powers. The concert provided regular diplomatic conferences, mechanisms for crisis management, agreement on the balance of power, collective action against revolutions. Historian Paul Schroeder has argued that the concert was one of the most successful international systems in history, maintaining peace for nearly a century. But even this system eventually failed. The First World War represented a catastrophic breakdown of the IR international system. In its aftermath, the world experienced another transition, the collapse of four empires of German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman Russian, the concept of the League of Nations, the rise of new ideologies like communism and fascism, the emergence of the United States and Japan as major powers. The League of Nations represented an ambitious attempt to transition from power politics to collective security. But as Professor E. Ishkar famously argued in his book The 20 Years Crisis, the League failed because it was based on idealistic assumptions that ignored the realities of power. The end of the Second World War ushered in another fundamental transition, the bipolar international system, the nuclear age, decolonization, and the emergence of new states, the institutionalization of international cooperation like UN, IMF, World Bank, the ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism, the Cold War was itself a period of constant transition. from nuclear monopoly to nuclear parity, from Western dominance to the rise of the Third World, from the post war consensus to the challenges of the 1970s. Professor John Geddes, in his seminal work, The Long Peace, argued that nuclear weapons created a unique form of stability, but at the cost of constant anxiety about potential annihilation. The end of Cold War represented perhaps the most dramatic transition in modern international relations. Fukuyama famously proclaimed the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy had achieved ideological victory. But Samuel Huntington offered a very different interpretation in The Clash of Civilizations, arguing that the future world be characterized by conflict between cultural and religious realities. Both these perspectives were immediately challenged by events. Students, we have seen that IR has always been characterized by transitions, but today we are experiencing transitions on a scale and at a speed unprecedented in the human history. Let's examine the most important of these transitions. The most discussed transition in contemporary IR is the shift of power from west to east, from north to south. China's economic growth has been extraordinary. Consider these figures. In 1990, China's GDP was less than 2% of global GDP. Today, China represents approximately 18% of global GDP. China has lifted over 800 million people out of poverty. China is now the world's largest trading nation. But China's rise is not merely economic. As Professor David Schambach has observed, China is rapidly modernizing its military. China is expanding its diplomatic influence. China is promoting alternative models of development, and it is challenging American leadership in Asia and beyond. This has led to what Professor Graham Allison calls the Thucydides trap, the tendency for rising powers and established powers to fall into conflict. Allison studied 16 historical cases of power transition and found that 12 resulted in war. The question of whether China and US can manage this transition peacefully is perhaps the most important question in contemporary IR. But China is not alone. India is also experiencing rapid growth and increasing international influence. India is now the world's fifth largest economy. India has a large and increasingly skilled workforce. It is developing its military capabilities and expanding its diplomatic footprint. Indian diplomat and scholar Shivashkar Menon has argued that India's rise represents a return to historical patterns rather than a novel development. So we must also consider Brazil's emergence as a regional and global power, Russia's reassertion of great power status, Turkey's expanding influence in multiple regions, Indonesia's growing economic and diplomatic weight. The transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world is perhaps the most fundamental change in the distribution of power since 1945. The post 1945 IR and its institutions are experiencing unprecedented stress. The United Nations Security Council reflects the power distribution of 1945, not that of today in 2026. The permanent members P5 exclude major powers like India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and Pakistan. The veto power can paralyze the organization. The UN's legitimacy is increasingly questioned. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, argued that the UN must be reformed or risk irrelevance. The WTO dispute settlement mechanism has been paralyzed. The appellate body has been blocked. The United States and China are engaged in trade conflicts outside WTO frameworks. Regional trade agreements are proliferating. We are seeing the emergence of alternative institutions, BRICS and the new development bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Professor Amitav Acharya has argued that we are moving toward a multiplex world where multiple institutions and frameworks coexist. For decades, the ideological context was between capitalism and communism. Today, the ideological landscape is far more complex. Liberal democracy is facing challenges. The rise of populism in Europe and the Americas, the questioning of democratic institutions, the success of authoritarian models, the perception that democracy has failed to deliver for many citizens. Fareed Zakaria and his influential work warned of the illiberal democracy, where elections exist but rights and freedoms are eroded. China offers an alternative model, economic growth without political liberalization, state capitalism, technological governance. Nationalism is a unifying force. Professor Daniel Bell has argued that China's model may be more suitable for developing countries than Western democracy. We are also seeing the resurgence of religious and cultural identities, political Islam, Hindu nationalism, Christian nationalism in the United States, the defense of traditional values. Samuel Huntington's thesis about the clash of civilizations appears increasingly relevant, even if his specific predictions were often wrong. AI is transforming international relations, autonomous weapon systems, AI powered surveillance, AI and economic competition, AI's impact on military strategy. Professor Henry Kissinger, in his book, The Age of AI, warned that AI represents a fundamental challenge to human decision making. Cyberspace has become a new domain of conflict and cooperation. Cyber warfare, cyber espionage, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, the challenge of attribution and deterrence. Joseph Nye, the renowned scholar, has argued that cyberspace requires new concepts of power and security. We must also consider biotechnology and its implications for warfare and economics. Space is a domain of competition and cooperation, quantum computing and its impact on encryption and security, renewable energy and its implications for geopolitical competition. Climate change is perhaps the most profound challenge facing the international community today. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, mass migration, resource scarcity, and conflict over water and arable land. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) is warned that we are approaching irreversible tipping points. Climate change is also reshaping international relations. The Paris Agreement and its implementation, competition between the US and China on climate issues, the transformation of global energy market, the rise of climate diplomacy. Professor David Victor has argued that climate change requires unprecedented levels of international cooperation. Environmental issues are increasingly central to security, like water scarcity, food security, energy security, environmental refugees. Traditional international relations focused on state security. Today, we are witnessing a transition to human security, individual rights, protection from violence and exploitation, economic security, health security, food security. The COVID 19 pandemic demonstrated both the importance and limitations of human security approaches. Students, we have examined the evidence of transition. Now we must consider how different theoretical approaches understand these transitions. Realists emphasize the continuity of power politics, as Hans Morgenthau famously stated. International politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. From a realist perspective, transitions are primarily about shifts in the distribution of power. The fundamental nature of international relations remains unchanged. States pursue their interests through the most effective means available. Institutions reflect the interests of the powerful. John Mearsheimer, in his book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, argues that great powers are always seeking to maximize their relative power and that transition periods are particularly dangerous. For realists, transition is a change in the distribution of power, but the essential character of international relations remains constant. Liberals emphasize the possibility of progress. Robert Keown and Joseph Nye, in their seminal work Power and Interdependence, argued that international institutions can constrain power, economic interdependence creates mutual interest, cooperation is possible even in an anarchic system. Democratic states are more peaceful. For liberals, transition represents progress, the movement toward a more cooperative, institutionalized, and peaceful international system. Whereas constructivists emphasize the role of ideas and identities, Alexander Vendith famously argued anarchy is what states make of it. For constructivists, interests are socially constructed, identities shape interests, norms and values matter. Change is not predetermined but can be shaped by human agency. For constructivists, transition involves changes in how states understand themselves and their interests. Critical theorists question the very foundations of the field. Marxism emphasizes economic structures, post-colonialism challenges Western dominance, feminism highlights gender biases in IR, post-structuralism questions the meanings we take for granted. For critical theorists, transition requires a fundamental rethinking of the field itself. The students, CSS and PMS candidates, you must always consider Pakistan's position in the international system. Pakistan sits at the intersection of several key transitions: the rise of China and the China Pakistan Economic Corridor, the US China competition, the transformation of the Middle East, the challenges of Afghanistan, nuclear proliferation issues, climate vulnerability. Pakistan has attempted to navigate these transitions through maintaining multiple relationships with China, US, Saudi Arabia, Iran, strengthening regional institutions, SARC, SCO, developing nuclear deterrence, responding to security challenges, adapting to changing global norms. The current transition period presents Pakistan with both challenges and opportunities, balancing relations with competing powers, managing internal security challenges, economic development, climate resilience, regional cooperations. Dear students, whenever this question appears in CSS or PMS examinations, avoid extreme positions. Do not write that fundamental IR is simply a static study of fixed relationships. Equally, do not suggest that everything is changing so rapidly that no meaningful analysis is possible. Instead, present a balanced and sophisticated judgment. uh, Key points to remember are the international relations is defined by transition, not static patterns, but dynamic processes of change. Transition is now not new. The international system has always been evolving from Westphalia to the present. Contemporary transitions are unprecedented in their scope, speed, and complexity. Multiple transitions occur simultaneously: power transitions, institutions transitions like ideology transitions, technology transitions, and the environment transitions. Different theories understand transition differently. Realism, liberalism, constructivism, and critical theories all offer valuable insights in their own perspective. Pakistan must navigate these transitions, making strategic choices that protects its interests and contribute to regional and global stability. So, I would like to conclude today's lecture with this reflection: the study of IR is not merely the study of states, treaties, and wars. It is a study of human organizations across borders, how we have organized ourselves, how we organize ourselves now, and how we might organize ourselves in the future. The word transition captures something essential about our field, that international relations is never complete, never finished, never final. The world community is always in transition because the human beings who constitute it are always changing their identities, their interests, their technologies, and their aspirations. This is what makes the study of IR so intellectually demanding and so practically important. This is what makes it worthy worthy of your attention is future civil servants who will help shape Pakistan's response to these transitions. And this is the insight that will distinguish your examination answers because of those of other candidates. Thank you, dear students. May you approach the study of IR with the intellectual curiosity and analytical rigor that this examination demands.